better preparation that you do, the easier and more safe your fire is going to be. So to me, preparation is everything. Many times this time of year, we get calls from landowners saying, "Hey, I want to burn this spring," and if you haven't already started that burn planning process by now, you're already behind the eight ball a little bit. So, not saying that you can't get it, can't get burned this spring, but you know, fire breaks have to be mowed and they have to be mowed properly. Burn plan needs to be put in place. All these different things. So when we talk about preparation, we're going to talk a little bit about fire break types and dimensions. Talk about how we manage our fire breaks, and then talk about burn prep, and then what kind of pre-burn planning that we need in order to accomplish our objective. So fire breaks are the biggest thing, and we use fire breaks to delineate our boundary and make ignition easier, right? So this is going to be our access to the burn unit. If possible, fire breaks should be done the summer and fall prior to burning if you're burning in the springtime, right? So that late summer, fall time frame is probably the best time to get fire breaks put in. This allows that residue to break down over the winter, and mowed fire breaks also green up faster in the spring if you're going to be using them as a green fire break. And then, if need be, come springtime, they can be touched up where they need to be. If you get to the springtime and you're just starting, that touch up might happen the day of the burn if the burn boss doesn't like something. So, getting it done early is always the best. If you can get it done this week, get it done this week. So, the first and best use of fire breaks that we use out there currently are just the permanent fire breaks that exist already on the landscape. Rivers, creeks, lakes, ponds, roads. But obviously, they have some things associated with them that you also have to be a little bit careful about, right? Lakes, ponds, rivers, creeks, what are associated with those? Typically, trees. Trees can catch on fire and throw embers across our line, so we have to be very careful about those. The same thing with roads. Roads typically have what on them? One, they got traffic on them, which can cause us a problem, but they also have power poles, utility poles, which also cause problems. But in general, these are really great fire breaks to use because they don't burn, right? Gravel's not going to burn, water's not going to burn. So these are great permanent features to design your burn around. So if you can make your unit big enough to get to a permanent feature, make sure you do that. It's better than putting in something temporary. So a lot of times we'll look at, we pull up an aerial photograph of a potential burn. We'll look at these permanent features to say, well, we can use this roadway, if we expand it to the north, or we could use this creek bottom or this, pond or what have you as some sort of fire break. But more times than not, we're using what we call temporary fire breaks. And temporary fire breaks are just that. They're very temporary. They're meant to be there for when we're burning and then not necessarily there when we're done burning. So bare minimum fire breaks obviously are really good because dirt it's not going to burn. We use mowed fire breaks probably the most often. We use green fire breaks, but they're obviously limited certain times of the year. And then also crops and black lines. And we'll talk about each one of these. So probably one of my most favorite fire breaks that we utilize is going to be what I call the rototill fire break. And as you can see in this picture here, and I guess when I talk about bare dirt fire breaks, generally we typically want to limit this to either high risk areas or CRP, like previously crop ground. So if you're in a native range situation, we're not going to be utilizing disturbing the soil. But you can see here, so this is a really good fire break. This is rototilled up. You can see there's not much fuel. There's a little bit in there, but it's mainly bare dirt. And then they also, so this is a combination of mowing and a rototill. So then they also mowed this strip in right here. And so they would actually be lighting right off of this dirt patch right here. And the reason why they mowed this section right here is because that's called, we would call a heat reduction strip or a fuel reduction strip. So if we left this really tall grass right on this edge, one, it'd be really, really hot there. And so it'd be very difficult for any person to, or an equipment to be near it. Plus, that fuel is pretty tall, so it could easily spot and jump the ditch or jump the fire line here and get into this area. So we would actually light off of this and let it back into this heavier fuel off there. This is a really great fire break, probably one of the best examples of a good rototilled fire break that I've seen. Now you can put in a rototill fire break or a disc fire break or any kind of bare dirt fire break, and it can be bad. So the key is to disc it to bare mineral soil. Get rid of that vegetation as much as possible, because if there's any kind of lots of residual vegetation on this line, this bare dirt, it can actually smolder and creep across it. And so you want to, a lot of times this takes multiple passes. And this is the benefit of doing it the fall or late summer prior, is that you could come back in the springtime and hit it one more time after some of the stuff has been broken up and knock them back. Now, if I was using this on my CRP, I would probably just I'd probably just let it go and go to annual weeds. That'd be great for wildlife habitat. But if you're concerned about erosion or anything like that, you could actually come in and seed it down to, some kind of vegetation type, back to natives, or, do like a clover or something like that if it's in a CRP. Here's a really great picture of what we call a disc fire break. Again, disc multiple times. I think there was probably 8 or 9 passes done on this. You can see the vegetation off to the right here is the CRP field. Again, don't do this on native rangeland, but on CRP it's fine. You could come in and revegetate it if you would like. Again, one of the biggest problems we see is really poorly constructed disc fire breaks. So they'll go out there and take a disc like a day or two before a burn and turn the soil over, and you have all these like big clumps of grass and stuff like that where it potentially could smolder underneath and creep across your line. So if you're going to be doing a disc fire break, I always recommend doing it in the fall. Turn that soil over, try to turn it really good, and then come back in right before the burn and hit it one more time, touch it up as it dries out. Again, this takes multiple passes to accomplish, but burning out, we didn't use a single. This was like a 80 or 90 acre CRP field that we did. We didn't use a single drop of water on this entire burn. We had we had pumpers, we had water tenders. We didn't use a single drop of water on it. And the landowner actually goes in and puts clover fire breaks for like food plots and broodery and habitat for birds on this place. Now, in some cases, when we're burning kind of in our oak woodland areas, um, we use just a leaf blower and a backpack leaf blower or handheld leaf blower to blow trails through, and we light off of them. So this is one right here where we're basically the left side here is our burn unit. We blew all the leaves to the right, and we're going to basically light off of that. And our fuel is, so small that, we can get away with having this bare dirt. Now, the one thing you have to be concerned about here would be if there was any tree that caught on fire and potentially would throw any embers across our line over here. So you'd have to have patrol checking for those things as they're going along. Another good option is a vegetated fire break, green fire break, as they're commonly referred to. These fire breaks are really good, but they only work when it's green out. So you basically have to wait until mid-April for them to really be effective. And they also don't. They also aren't going to stop fire completely, and they're not designed necessarily to stop fire completely. Their main purpose of a vegetative fire break is to slow down the fire as that fire hits it. Now, there are some instances where we could use a vegetative fire break. Um, Say it was hayed late summer and there was barely no residual fuel in it, and then it greened up and then we burned into it. Then in that case, it would most often it would be not enough residual vegetation in there for it to burn, so we could actually use it as a fire break. But most often, there's still residual vegetation in these vegetated fire breaks that still burn, and you can see that right here. You can see that it's still burning, but you see like there's barely any visible flames in it, and it's fairly smoky. So you could actually go in and snuff this out with a swatter or ATV, UTV with a small pumper in the back of it. And also, you could use certain crops. So if you got a crop field, bean stubble, and you planted rye or any kind of other vegetated break, here that would be um, very good as well. But also, crop stubble does burn. So another way you could use a fire break is what we either call black lining, or you could actually just use previous burns. One common example was, maybe you had a wildfire, your neighbor had a wildfire, and you could use that wildfire that happened over the winter time as a fire break and basically throw your embers right into that already blackened area. But we also use black lining, so we can actually go out into an area that we're going to burn in the future and actually pre-burn the fire breaks. So when we get there, we could just burn right off of those and not have to lay down any water. Now, if you got a bunch of equipment and a bunch of crew that can do this, this would be a pretty good option. And can be done under less ideal conditions. So there may be a day where the burn is not, or the burn day is not as good. You could go put in these black lines. So one of the other options you can use, and sometimes we have to use, is basically a dirt fire break through dozer. So as you can see in this picture, the neighbors on the left side of the screen here didn't want to burn, and so we needed to create decent access along this fence line. So we actually brought in the dozer to clear out some trees and create this line. Now, there's a brush pile over here on the right side and some of these taller elm trees here that potentially could be a problem. So you'd want to burn the brush pile prior to burning and then watch these trees to make sure that they didn't catch on fire as you burn. I would probably only use this, like in this particular scenario, I'd only use this as an upwind fire break instead of the downwind fire break, so you weren't having to maintain control on this line. But a lot of times we use this as new access. Sometimes we need access into a burn unit, and you could use a dozer, and then you can come in and revegetate these areas with native grasses and wildflowers, or maintain it as a fire break for the future. Again, typically we're not using, well, we'll use this on native rangelands just for the simple fact that we need to cut in new access. And a lot of times we're burning in areas where we have really heavy cedar trees that needs very specific fire break access. I would say 90% of the burns that I do are probably done through mowed fire breaks. And so mowed fire breaks alone aren't obviously going to stop fire. So we have to use what we call wet lines. We have to lay down a wet line, and we'll talk about how to do that later on. But mowed fire breaks, a couple things. Again, mowing and shredding the summer and fall prior is almost a must. Okay. If you can hay it, that would be even better. Haying it and removing the bales off of the site, which what happened here, you can see that the vegetation is really good. But what happens, especially if you're in CRP and you're doing a mowed fire break, what can happen is that you got so much fuel in that fire break that it basically creates these like kind of false windrows in the fire break and actually creates more of a headache than anything. So again, the year prior, hay them if you can at least minimum mow it. If you're still planning on trying to burn this spring and want to put a mowed fire break in, it's much easier to do with like rangeland, where you have lower fuel loads. But if you do it in CRP, my recommendation is mow it, mow it in different directions and mow that windrow. And sometimes you'll have to go over it like 4, 5, 6, 7 times to really break up that windrow and to break down that vegetation. So make sure you do that. But again, can't stress this enough. Mowing the fall prior or haying if at all possible. Now, if you're in a federal program, you got to make sure to get permission to do that. It's unfortunate because it's a huge safety issue for us. But make sure you get permission from Farm Service Agency or NRCS to put in your mowed fire breaks on CRP. So as a general rule, when we talk about fire breaks, we want these fire breaks to be at least 10 times as wide as the adjacent vegetation. So if you got 5 foot tall big blue stem, we want at least a 50-foot wide fire break. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is, why we want such a large fire break. So again, going back to a little bit about green management of fire breaks, all fire breaks need managed, and green fire breaks are definitely a big part of it. So here's a picture of this piece here on the right where these people are standing. This is actually hayed in late summer. And so there was no regrowth of vegetation in here. And then this is like a late April burn. So you can see that like they're just sitting around talking because we basically just lit this fire and let it go because it wasn't going anywhere. Like this stuff could absolutely not burn no matter how hard we tried because it was basically cut down to the ground and the only regrowth that was in there was green. So they need managed. And even if you don't have that option, like if you have a green fire break that was managed into your prescribed or your CRP contract or something, you need to manage that fire break. And that includes annual mowing of it and mowing of it several times a year to get that nice green growth going. Tilled fire breaks, again, installed in the fall, touched up in the spring. And don't expect that crop stubble to be sufficient. Bean stubble will burn. It won't burn as bad as corn stubble, but corn stubble burns is really hard to put out because it gets in them residual stalks and smolders, and it's kind of a pain. So don't expect that crop stubble to be sufficient, although it does work as a pretty decent fire break, especially if you can disc around it. So here's kind of just, a couple feet tall vegetation. We got a mowed path and we got rototilled right down the middle. Now, what do you think the reason why the rototilled is right down the middle of this path and not all the way to the fence line? Imagine if we're lighting, this is our burn unit here, and we're lighting off of this rototilled patch. What happens if it does creep across here or does spot across? If it spots across and catches right here, we've got at least, 5, 8 feet to catch it before it jumps the fence. Whereas if we did this dirt tilt path right on that fire line or that fence line, if it jumped on us, it would already be across the fence and we'd have to cut the fence. So always consider that when you're putting in your fire breaks or even laying down your ignition line, which we'll talk about later. Again, I cannot stress enough that prior preparation to a burn is absolutely critical. My recommendation on grasslands is that a late summer, fall mowing or haying is absolutely critical. Allows that residue time to break down during the winter, and if needed, you can touch it up in the springtime. So where do we place our fire breaks? Most people think that, well, this is my boundary. I'm going to burn this, but that's not always the best place to actually put our fire breaks. Sometimes it's best to work with our neighbors and make a burn unit bigger to make it safer. Sometimes we need to make a burn unit smaller to make it safer. Sometimes we need to cut out certain areas to make it safer. My general rule of thumb is um, making making a making a burn unit some sort of basic shape that a child would recognize: a square, a rectangle, a circle. The If you can make one of those three shapes, that's going to be probably your best bet for a fire break. Now, if you make it some like obtuse, oblong, weird, star shape or something like that, it makes it very difficult. So that's why we remove, like, any wooded draws or dog legs or anything like that. So I'm trying to make a good fire break where it makes sense. Don't constrain yourself to just your property when you're writing the burn plan. Always be thinking about, where can I maybe do this elsewhere, or maybe your neighbor has the same problem, or CRP or something like that. Like, if you can burn, why burn your 100 acres if you can burn 200 acres and double the amount of fire we get on the ground. You also want to minimize your hazards within your burn unit, and most of the time this comes in the form of trees. So a lot of times there's a tree cutting operations that happen prior to actually burning. So two things: you can make sure these trees are all trees are cut within 200 foot of the edge at a minimum. Cut and move them either into the unit, like well into the unit, or out of the unit. You can burn these brush piles. Two different ways to burn your brush piles. You can burn them in the wintertime when there's snow on the ground. The problem is that typically winter brush pile burns, you don't get complete consumption of them. And it seems like if it dries out, the snow goes away real fast. The vegetation is going to be dormant and really susceptible to a wildfire. So the other option is to actually burn in early summertime, where everything's really green out. You get higher fuel moistures on the landscape, a little bit higher temperatures, and you can actually burn that brush pile down to ash usually. So you're typically looking at like mid to late May to early June when we get really good rains to burn that. If you're mowing your fire break, again, mowing the fire break to the fall prior is the best. Sometimes you can use a rake to rake the residue outside of the unit. You want to make sure you rake it to the outside and not the inside. If you rake to the inside of the burn unit, that it's just going to sit there and smolder on that line, and your wet line is going to dry out. So again, if at all possible, bail and remove the fire break if at all possible. Also, there are other hazards out there that we want to try to minimize, right? We want to try to avoid utility poles. We can use, wet line around them, burn them out prior to. We can take them out completely. Protect any fences that you need. Most of the time, we burn through fences because fences are one of, like, probably the most common area for cedar trees to start getting going, because birds will grab seeds and they'll sit on the fence posts and then drop them. Protect any hunting blinds, old buildings or pumps, any kind of those hazards. We want to make sure we mitigate those through our preparation. So again, we can burn out prior to, we can take a weed eater around it, we can remove the hunting blind if necessary, um, things of that nature. So if you've ever had hay bales are especially big culprits. These things burn and they burn forever. So make sure you get rid of the hay bales right on the edges of the unit. These old buildings are like tinder boxes. They've been drying out for 100 years sometimes. Shelter belts, we want to, not necessarily, I don't care about protecting shelter belts, but if you don't want them to go, you should protect them. If they're full of cedar trees, I'd say burn them. And then again, preparation is huge. 90% of a burn, how well it goes, is about prior preparation. And so, the most frustrating thing for me is people that wait till the last second to plan a burn, and it can happen, and it happens all the time, but it's just frustrating. So try to plan a burn at least 1 year prior to wanting to burn, so you can consider planting any green fire breaks You may need to defer grazing if you're burning in rangeland. 6 months prior to burning, you want to make sure you put together your written burn plan. You can ask assistance in writing this burn plan. I just did a 2-hour webinar the other 2 weeks ago about how to write a burn plan that you can check out on our YouTube channel, hopefully soon. 6 months prior, at least 6 months prior, install them fire breaks. You can put in black lines potentially if necessary. Also, you want to talk with your neighbors and the fire chief about burning, about what's going to when you're planning on burning, just so that they're aware that it is coming, so they're not surprised and they think it's a wildfire. And then also you want to either burn brush piles or move heavy fuels away from the burn unit boundaries because they are also a number one cause of problems on a burn. Brush piles, especially, even just like small little brush piles can create big headaches for everybody. And then as you get closer to the burn, a couple weeks out, you want to make sure that you check your burn plan, gather up all your equipment, talk to your crew, check your fire breaks, open up gates, let your fences down as you're kind of getting closer and closer, right? Then you want to fill up any stock tanks or water tenders prior to your burn. Make sure you have those either located or fill them up depending on the time of year. Also, a big thing a couple weeks out, you want to make sure your equipment is working properly. You want to mix your drip torch fuel, and we'll talk about the equipment next, but make sure all that stuff is ready to go. Because when we talk about preparation, there's often a very limited window of opportunity to burn. And like last year, there was maybe like 12 or 13 days between March and April that were good burn days. So if you're not ready when one of those days pops up, then you miss that opportunity to burn. So make sure you're ready. The more prepared you are, obviously, the more you're going to get on the ground because there's nothing worse than all of a sudden next day you're like, oh man, tomorrow's going to be a good day, but we haven't got those pumpers checked out or equipment loaded or drip torch fuel, and then you're up till 4 in the morning trying to gather all that stuff. So prior preparation is absolutely critical.